Testing. Hello and welcome to another episode of P5Live Sessions, where we will improvise with P5JS within the P5Live environment and see what kind of weird things we can find, just exploring for an hour, playing with code, seeing where it takes us. So, what are we going to do today? I spontaneously suggest I check out tan. This came up last week while looking at modulo. It was thrown out, hey, check out the tan function, which is something I don't use very often. It's come up a couple times in the Oscillation Sandbox project, but I haven't played with it much at all. And with daylight savings, 9 o'clock quickly sprang upon me. So it's great to just say, hey, let's do some improvised coding and see what tan can offer for us. So the first thing I'm going to do is check out the reference page on tan and just kind of see what do they have happening here. See if this works in the draw. It's probably really small. I'm going to say stroke 255 so we can see the thing. There it is. It's hiding behind the code. Maybe I add a background so that it refreshes. And I need to make this thing much bigger. Yeah, this is a tiny little line. I wonder if I just said like times width. That's probably way too much, but curious. Ooh, what do these values do? Too much, but that's kind of interesting what happened there. Okay, what if this was times width? Whoops, we have 2 times there. Divided by 2. Interesting. And what happens if I spread this thing out further? So I'm going to say let x equal a map of I that goes from 0 to 100 and say 0 to width. And I'm going to use that as its position. Interesting. It's a little too high up. I think this should be height divided by 2. And also height divided by 2. All right. And this is going way too high up. So I'm going to say quarter, 5, 6, 7. Just mess with this thing until we start to see an interesting form there. 15. Yeah, quite interesting to see what effect that has on this shape, what this thing is doing. 40, 30, 50, 60. How little or big this thing can be and make this form. So I'm going to say stroke weight 5, make it thicker. 10, so we can really see this thing. I can hide the reference now. It was a nice starting point. And this A is kind of fixed, that it's getting this value added to it. And if I want to animate this thing, I'm going to test out having this value grow constantly. So instead of ink, I'm going to say, actually right here, I'm going to say plus frame count times 0.01, which is probably even too much. That's quite a nice movement this thing makes. That's times 70, 190. So this is about sort of how slopey this shape is. How much do we see these things moving? But their overall height seems to be based upon, why do they get so big? It's not this thing. It is, that's in the center. This is being told to be in the center. What if I get rid of that? Interesting. Then we have these slopes. I wonder if it's about this overall size, maybe this thing, this whole formula being divided in half. It's still getting quite quite large. Because if I got rid of it altogether, let's take it away. Yep, we just have a flat line. And it's back. And yeah, interesting that just the way this thing works, it's just kind of spiking up to the top. It's really getting a big value. And then these things cause the sloping. And if I want to reverse this, I can go minus. That creates a nice movement as well. Maybe it's nice to fade the background a little bit and just see what that does to this thing. We're like remixing the default. And this A is just plus ink. So this was like saying 50. And if I say it's a 20, okay, it's just the frequency of these things. So if I said 100, yeah, we should have one cycle of this thing because we're looping 100 times. So that should probably be a variable. Let loop count be 100 for now. And just say divide by that much and loop that much. And that way this could be divided by 2. No, it doesn't work. It needs to be a float. How interesting. 0.0. Does that need to be a float to work properly? I think so. I think without telling it explicitly to be a float, it might not be working quite right. Divided by 4, we can get an interesting amount of these things. 10 of these things. What kind of movement that causes. Starts to look kind of organ-like. Yeah, everything is kind of moving together. And maybe that's because I hasn't been involved at all yet. It might be time to introduce I down below and see what effect that could have on this thing. But I'm going to go back down to a smaller ratio, maybe 3. So we don't have too many of these shapes here. And I'm going to start naming this thing so I have a name for the project. And we're just going to call this tan sessions. Okay, and what happens if I start to introduce I here? So if I don't use, I should maybe continue to use A, and if I said plus I, just to throw that in there, it throws off the timing of these things and they start to look like interesting sprout rising things. Maybe it's fun to say, let's be times 0.75 times 0.75 or even more. 8. You start to look like things coming out of the ground. 9. It can be right at the ground. It doesn't have to be centered in the page. Yeah, and super interesting. These values go so high. They're going far off the page. Not quite sure yet how you control that, but it's okay. This is about how slow those things are going. We could speed it way up, but that's too fast. 1 was good. Yeah, so I is involved in there, and maybe it should be some amount of I. If I said 0.1 or a larger number, 2, 3, interesting, starts to create a different kind of wave movement. That's quite nice. That's like an interlacing movement where a whole set of them take off and go up, and then the next, and then the next, kind of a takeoff pattern. Interesting with 5, it's really similar, but in the other direction. There, it's kind of slowing way down. This is called guess and check game. Yeah, that's also quite nice. It's like they get populated on the bottom, they start to sprout, and then they take off. So maybe with spring coming, it's practically here. Maybe we need to play with these things in a certain color domain. Let's go all green on this thing and see what happens when we go towards spring and see what this thing can become. It's a question, how interesting is it when they're thicker or thinner? Maybe they should also change their stroke weight over time. That could be interesting, that they start out as these little thin things and then eventually get thicker. So I will play with a stroke here inside of this loop, which needs some tabbing. And it's a question if this value somehow should find its way in there. I have no idea. Let's see what happens if I throw a tan in there. At the moment, we only have one tan. That's no good. I can't just throw it in there. What am I needing? Right, I need just this thing. Whoa, wild. All right, that thing freaks out. Divided by 10. Yeah, so the timing is kind of totally wrong for what these things should be doing. But that could have, there's a lot of reasons for that. Wow, interesting. Who knows if we want tan in there. One thing I also need to try out that I remember being quite interesting in one of the oscillation sandboxes was sealing a thing. It suddenly became steps. So I'm going to try that out. If I said seal and wrap this around, then we change from nice smooth motions to steps, which could be interesting when there's far more of these things. Now we're getting an interesting kind of backwards walking animation. If I just make one of these things, we'll see what these steps look like. Yeah, so this is with steps. Without steps, we get this nice smooth movement. Seal. If I throw a minus in there, it does something. Or if I said plus, it moves in that direction. Use I. Where? I've got one eye hanging out here in the middle. Maybe it was an earlier comment and I just now looked at the chat. Yeah, but maybe I needs to be in there multiple times. Or this could be a reference back to the stroke weight timing. I'm going to take away seal for a minute and actually try to bring this thing back a bit where it was. Maybe it was at 13 and this was at 3. There we go. Had this growing. Try this a couple more times. Something that could be interesting is to try and bend this line instead of it being flat from the ground, maybe mixing this tan with some sine cosine to sort of wrap this line in a circular way instead of running straight across the page. So let me stay with this and I'm going to test out what the positions should be. Maybe I'm going to I'm going to say let y equal a cosine of I coming in. Okay, on the stroke weight. Ah, true. Yeah, true. They could be, with the stroke weight, they could get some various levels in there. If I went I divided by 10, then we'd get a thin to thick. I mean, it's super tempting to put a sine wave in here, but I'm trying to stick with tan, even though I'm about to play with a cosine here. Yeah, because with this, I could imagine a sine wave with the right timing, frame count times 0.01, then times like 10. Actually, it should be like double or triple as fast so that they have time by the time they get to the top to get thicker. That's probably too fast. 0.5. Interesting, it has kind of a pulse. Yeah, but I'm curious about trying to wrap this thing around a bit in a circle form. So let's see how this could work. If I did something like, what do I need to do? 2 pi divided by LC. I think it's something like this. I always forget what this little formula is. And let's see what it's like if I swap this out and say, and then it needs to be that times some amount, height divided by 4. So let's try introducing this. Height times 5 plus y. And do the same here. 5 y is a cosine of 2 pi divided by LC. This could be totally off. And if x was a sine, I just overwrite it. X equals a sine of 2 pi divided by LC times height divided by 4, and actually width divided by 2 plus. And then, okay, we need I times this amount. There we go. I forgot to add an I in there. Use I. And interesting. Okay, so now I've got that circle going. And it's doing something totally different than I expected. Probably should have cloned the sketch. But it'd be interesting to let this tan shape also splinter off to the X direction. So maybe I can still undo things and bring that back to somewhere where it was. I'll clone it once. And maybe it's nice to make this a formula or like a variable that I can use multiple times. So we'll call this t and let t equal this thing. And use t on one of these, plus t. This is all missing some of those values. There we go. Okay, but they're sharing the same value, so it just becomes a diagonal, which is normal with these kinds of things. So maybe I'll call this a ty, and I'll use it there, and I'll invent a tx, copy paste, and give it a unique timing. So things are a little bit different. If it's a 2-to-1, we'll get some kind of laser looking show. I'm going to turn that a little bit slower. Or it could keep the same speed maybe, and it just has a different ratio involved in there. Maybe temporarily change the stroke weight to be a constant, so I can just see what these things are doing line-wise, what we're creating here. Yeah, making some wild laser patterns, laser scanning. Slow that number down, then we get some patterns that we can recognize. The movement of 2 is quite nice. Okay, let's go in a smaller direction, 0.5, 0.2. So now this is slowed way down, which could be interesting in both directions because it was going really fast and producing these lines, but the slower this thing goes, the more it is to sort of leave a pattern behind. It's kind of interesting. Now we can kind of see a circular pattern there, and each of these are taking turns kind of fanning out in different directions. Temporarily turn off the background. Oh, whoops, the exact opposite. There's the movement, turn off the background and let these things trace out for a little while. See what kind of shape they make. Maybe they should get even thinner so that they take longer to fully saturate. I would say even thinner / these things could be having some opacity or translucency, so that it takes a while for these things to build up an image. It'll be a little dark for a bit, and then it has more time to build this thing up. Kind of cheating by using sine and cosine in here. Ooh, that's a super nice grid that it builds right there. I like this kind of pixelated grid around all those fine lines. Yeah, maybe the color should change over time. That way it won't just become a solid block. So it might not be a bad idea to change my color mode to HSB so it's easier to handle. And then I should be playing with tan. Let's first try leaving it RGB. I need to quickly look up, when I play with tan, does it tell me what the output is of that value? When you throw a number into tan, I think I need to print it out once and say print tan is not a number, frame count times 0.001, so it's super small. Let's go a little bigger. Okay, so this goes to like negative, it goes up to like -10, and then does it go to +10? Something even crazier. Okay, I really got to slow that thing down, especially when it gets to the large exponential growth. So it's going 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Oh, it goes up into like the hundreds range. Okay, so that number gets really big. So, I don't know, let's throw a tan on this and see what happens. Tan frame count times 0.01. So it takes it forever, and then all of a sudden it's going to have this huge splash of color, and maybe I actually need an ABS so it's a positive value all the time, because we don't really want a negative there. And then it might be interesting that it just slowly introduces red and then goes bam. I can follow the same number, printing it out just for a bit. So now it's 1. That went way, way fast. Okay. So it has to be a slower number to even see the thing. But I may also just need to multiply it by some other number. Times 10. So we're in like the practically 0 range. I guess for the majority of the time it's sitting out kind of near under 1. Let's just say times 100, see what happens. And now this number should be getting much bigger. I guess we're in the yellow domain. There we go. Okay, it's becoming yellow and hits like a highlight. So this could be interesting. It's almost creating, it's a nice kind of like specular highlight on a 2D shape. That's quite interesting. I wonder what happens if I speed it up and let it do this thing quicker and more often. I'll start it over from scratch. So it's like yellow, green. Yeah, that creates quite a cool shading. It might be interesting to constrain this number on some of them to limit it from getting too far out. There's also a lot of these things. I'm going to change LC to be a way smaller number and see what this thing is like if we're just drawing far fewer shapes. And maybe these things should be rotating around faster. And that's about this tan here. So they're kind of, there we go. That gets them spinning a little quicker. Okay, but it's interesting just seeing where these values go with time in a distance. So I'm also kind of curious, like this is a tan X, a tan Y, and I wonder what it's like if these are, that creates also an interesting shape. It's kind of like a grid. It looks a bit like it's, yeah, I should just leave this, be patient. It really starts to build this like folded paper image. It's always tempting to add some visual feedback to this just to give those items a little bit of soft edge, or to play with those movements that it makes to bleed a little bit. I might introduce that and then just toggle it on and off just to see what that does to this thing. But I'm also curious just to play with like a single line moving in different tan directions as a movement mechanism. Okay, but let's clone this once and just quickly introduce feedback. We don't really have any code here. I can turn off my printing. And I'm going to say let FB. I really need to add this thing as a snippet to P5Live. Create graphics, width and height. At the bottom, FB will get everything. It's a question if this should be a 1-to-1 or I scale it down. And then I should do a image mode center. Maybe a push and a pop in case I distort it. Move to the center and draw our face feedback, which is at 0, 0, and technically width and height, and that quickly kind of freaks out and slows things down. So maybe I do a resize width divided by 2, height divided by 2. But then that would be really low poly. But it goes in a totally different direction. Now these things can bleed into the whole page. So I'm going to turn the stroke opacity down, which might not make a difference. Ooh, that's kind of interesting. This little, never seen that before. Wow, this kind of half-tone ripple. It's gone now. It's about maybe the stroke weight here. I can control it being there more if it's thinner. There we go. I might be crunching the canvas a little bit too much, and maybe it needs a bit of background. So these things fade out a little bit. Let's try adding background. No, background just takes everything away. That's no fun. Or does it need background there? Nope. FB.no smooth. Whoops. I don't know if that makes a difference. Yeah, but interesting. This thing just quickly spread out, and that's it. So let me slow down its movement again. Nope, it was good having it twist. Use an odd number there, see what that's doing. Turn off that resizing. Yeah, without a resize, it's just 1-to-1 over it. And so this could be like a I'll call it FB scale equals 1.001. So it's just barely bigger or smaller. But it's saturating so quickly. Gotta try a difference just to see what that does. That's kind of interesting. Let's bring back the scaling. Ooh, that creates quite an interesting effect, but I wonder why these things just totally disappear. This shading is quite cool. Without it, it becomes such. Maybe it's nice to pulse on and off. The question is, why are these things just disappearing? And it could be because they have such a low opacity now. Where is everything going? That's the question. How strange. Oh, there we go. Bring back opacity. Ah, interesting. Maybe it's weird. Why at the beginning is it no problem when there's just a little bit of opacity, and then it's a big deal if it's does it make a difference if the blend mode happens after the feedback? I don't think so. Wow, but those create really nice artifacts. Whoops. Ooh, that is slow. Oh, man. Let's try that again. Yeah, interesting. I wonder if I can pulse this blend mode, because if I don't do blend mode difference, the default is blend mode blend, I believe. And that's like normal. Ah, this might be happening. No, I don't know why. But let me try to just alternate these. If frame count modulo 3 equals 0. Let's do this. Oh, pressing a funky command key. There we go. Else. Whoa, what is happening here? I think I'm pressing a really weird modifier key on this keyboard. Uh-oh. We're gonna quickly try that again. That was strange. Okay, all is back. Don't know what key I'm pressing. So this got activated, or else this thing. So now it's a bit of both. It doesn't last very long. It really goes flying away. And if this was like without a zoom, it stays a bit longer. Here it's shrinking inward. Yeah, so I'm from reading the chat, if I understood right, to have the last 10 seconds of change in the code, add another color highlight. Ah, okay, maybe. I'm wondering why these things kind of disappear, and I wonder if it's because this is just taking so long to change through its colors that it's, whoops, wearing itself out. No, it just fades away. Really strange. wonder if it's because I let the stroke weights get so thin. Now they're thicker. It's just bizarre that all this stuff just disappears. Let me turn off the image for a minute. So this is without drawing that feedback image. That's interesting. Wow, and creates really soft little lines. So no feedback, but using, maybe this is this hybrid of blend mode and difference mode. Takes a while for it to build up. But creates really interesting specular points. Yeah, that's quite interesting. A very slow sketch. You have to wait forever for it to render this image. But are quite nice lines. And this has been a perfect circle. So that's also something I haven't played with is maybe introducing a bit of Lisa Zhu to this. Or I'll go ×2. This would be technically a 2-to-1 ratio. There we go. Or let me do it in the other way. We can get infinity happening. If we want infinity, or ×3 for a different kind of Lisa Zhu. And maybe this stroke weight should be able to leave more of a mark while these things move around. Nope, not so exciting. Let me go back to this and say this plus frame count times 0.1. Let's try that out. In some way this is cheating, having these sine and cosines in there. I should really just be playing with tan and seeing what it can do. So after having created that, which could also be much bigger, there's no reason it has to be just in the center of the page. It could be nice to let this thing be more immersive. I'll start it over and let it render once. Maybe a little bit thicker because it's crossing over a larger area. Very geometric shapes, like cutaways. Yeah, sorry if I share the code while you play along. Yeah, you have to type quickly. I would do co-coding, but there's a little hiccup right now I have to check out. I just got a report that it isn't working right now. So I need to look into that after this session. Hasn't been down for a long time, or it's been up for the last 3 months, no problem. And something weird is going on right now. So I can't share this in a co-code, but I can scan up and down. And what I wanted to try was tweaking some of these values to, I'm going to turn off this for a second. Interesting, those are those curves. Let me bring back this stroke weight. Okay, so we can really see the thing moving around. There is a handful of them. Stroke, there's like 30 of them happening. And they have such a, this is part of why we don't see a lot of them. I'd made their opacity so thin. Whoops, I just killed that. There we go. Yeah, so there's these different variables. I should be turning on and off and keeping in mind what they're doing. But it'd be interesting to play with a lot more tan and see what else tan can do for me. So I'm going to clone where we were. and tweak this and just see what happens. If these things become a tan, what does this end up doing to things? Do they go into chaos? Times 4, let's shrink it back to the middle. Change this to a tan as kind of an invert of tan. We'll lose the circular aspect that it had. The fan is going a little bit nuts. Yeah, these lines are much too thick. Let's make them more opaque and thinner and see what this thing is doing. Building a comb or a weird brush. And if this was a tan, what if it was just tan? What does that end up doing if it's 2 times tan? Creates a cable salad. But interesting nodes as it builds up. I'm going to reactivate this. Whoosh, that quickly wiped that out. Okay, interesting. I have those lines back. Now with difference. And I actually want to slow down this movement. Maybe even more if possible. That creates an interesting kind of floating lines in space on some trajectory. Facebook scale, the feedback scale. Ah, there we go. Wild. So this is using difference at a 1-to-1 ratio, where I guess things are probably inverting all the time. And if I give it a little bit of a scale, then we start getting some nice artifacts left behind of it in this difference world. Ooh, they leave some nice kind of bleeding edges, tapering off. At 1, they left quite a bit. Let's check out. Ooh, it's nice when it hits a couple of those spots and leaves a lot of ripples behind. Yeah, so when it's thin, we can't see it so well. When it's much thicker, it leaves more of a trace. Let me go back to something like 5 and have more of these things floating around now with this setup, just to see what it's like if it's just a bit more action happening there. We have an interesting line going down the center. But it's interesting how these things are kind of joined like an elbow. And let's tweak the colors a bit. I'm going to switch now finally to color mode HSB 100. And that'll change everything on here. All of a sudden, I'm going to say stroke. If I say 100, then it should be white. I could say 100, 100, and now it's red. Saturation could be 0, and then it's back to being white, or it could be kind of pale. And let's reintroduce this tan formula to our stroke and see what happens, or to the hue. Lots of color. Let's introduce this instead to the brightness or so. So it's going to have 100%. Let's clear it once. Let's attach this to the brightness and see what it's like when it's sometimes leaving white lines and black lines. At the moment, really fast. Maybe that should be slowed down. And the whole movement these things are making could be slowed way down. And actually, yeah, their stroke should definitely be different than one another. It should be hanging out down here and getting some eye in there, so that they have their own rhythm of when they turn one color to the next. And just to see what was this thing like if we went back to this circular motion with cosine and sine. Yep, you can see the sine movement in there. I'm going to go back to tan. We're just hanging out in tan tonight. Maybe I should do like a... Let these things, when it was tan, it got humongous. So I'm going to constrain a tan with the frame count to go from like 0 to 20 and see what happens. And say I times 5 plus. Or let it get up to 40. No, let's just have more of these things floating. Without drawing an image. Interesting. I always like it with the feedback on, but also interesting because of difference, what these things look like, just drawing shapes out for a while, building a more complex scene. If I went minus, I can have these movements going in an upward direction. Yeah, there's so many things happening here. It's a little chaotic. I'm going to clone it once and bring it back to being a little bit simpler. And see, with this setup with the blend mode, might be nice if it went back a bit to this like just walking across. So I'm going to turn off this X, and now everything is like back to being spaced out across. No, it's not. We need to use LC here. So everything is spread across the page. And for the Y, I'm going to override this, I think, with simply 0. I don't think I need anything here now. And let's start it over once and see what these things are doing. So this is happening because there's this TX involved. I'm going to take that away for a minute. So these things are back to being just upward and downward. They create some nice movements where they overlap each other and create this kind of rings. That's quite nice. I think I should let those get much thicker. Oh, whoops, that's the brightness. This is the thickness, how thick these things can get. Ooh, that creates a nice kind of, maybe too much. A nice kind of metallic pipes like quality. I'm going to start that over once. It kind of loses some of the illusion when they overlap each other. Maybe if I I should only let them get maybe as thick as half of how many I have so that they can't overlap each other's space, because I think it's nice when they aren't quite able to touch. They start to look a little bit like some kind of a tubing. I'm going to bring this back down to be a much slower ratio between them. No, then we lose. We really lose the formations. It becomes very obvious that's a tan. I'll go back to 4. Oh, bring it back. Where was I? 8. Okay, but it's obvious this should be LC divided by 2 to be just the right width. Maybe 3 if they should be a little bit thinner, but I think 2. It's nice when they can practically touch. And then the fewer I have, the thicker these things can be. So if I say I have 40 of them, no, that's not right. That's not the formula at all. Because now they should be allowed to get much thicker. So it needs to be something like width divided by LC maybe. Times 2. Potentially. Wow, now they look like kind of tungsten light bulbs. That's quite nice. It might be nice to give them as well some opacity now, so they don't build up such a solid color, and they're also hitting like the exact same spot where they're bright and dark. So maybe this needs to be varying a bit, or it's working well because it doesn't vary. And I'm going to give this an opacity of like 50 and see what that's like, that it slowly builds up brighter and brighter. No, that's still, whoops, wrong spot. It needs to be out here, 50. No, but without this sharp opacity, these become kind of gray blobs. So it needs full opacity. And maybe it's nice to introduce a little bit of color to this thing if I can find what the yellow region is. Let's introduce some saturation. That's in the green domain. Blue domain. Let's go the other way. Where is yellow? Red domain. Tricky to tell because it's inverting. Where is yellow? There it is. Maybe just a hint of color. Let this run again. And it's definitely a question of, what exactly should the rhythm of these things be? Was it nicer when there was more? Or was it just that there needs to be more shapes? Maybe some of these things should get a little bit faster, that I really slowed down. We'll create something else. Now we get kind of a stroke-like, or like a Beetlejuice-like striping when these things can move fast enough. They're constantly dark in the same spot, so what if I let this thing be faster, we'll get light and dark more often. Yeah, it's really interesting, these forms that this ends up creating. It really creates these, some kind of tungsten or tube. I think it's more convincing when they're thinner versus thicker. Test once, making these things just a few that can get really big. Plop, plop, plop. Yeah, but they don't have as nearly as much detail. They have more size, but then a bunch of other numbers I think have to change to get this detail. Let's go above 100 and see what it's like when they're much smaller. Haven't gone much over 100 yet. Or try, whoops, way too much. Although that looked interesting. Is that 200? Starts to look a little bit city-like. 300, let's jump right to 500 and see what this is doing. Now we're getting really obviously back to this initial movement of the tan wave going through. Yeah, I think at this point we're losing all of those effects that we had, but you go high enough and you start to get some interesting strobing. Why not? Let's say more and see if it can handle it. Okay, did that back down to around 80 to 120, I think was a nice value to play with. Even 80. And maybe this value where the saturation comes in, 20, should also be a little plus minus. If I went 16, it probably starts to go in the red domain, or 15. I bet is getting red. Not quite yet. 12. Up to... Oh, that quickly goes into the blue domain. And what happens if this was a tan frame count times 0.001 times 20? I think it was this number here that suddenly made that striping appear. If I add a 0 back, then we lose that striping as these move way slower. So getting rid of a 0 added this striping, and if I get rid of another 0, then these things will move really fast and create something else. Let's test out making fewer of these things, or not fewer, but having the wave of them be a different value. Infinite numbers to plug in there and see what those things do. Add one more 0. Okay, yeah, the stroke goes into all kinds of different domain. I think it was nice when it was just at 20 or 15. Just playing with this kind of yellow. Maybe it needs a noise or a plus. If noise is allowed here, I could do a 10 plus noise, frame count times 10. So it's just somewhere between, maybe not, oh, that was supposed to be a 10. There we go. So it hangs out in the kind of warm red to yellow domain. And just for kicks, reactivate face. I keep wanting to say FB Facebook. Feedback. That was at a big zoom. That's at a 1:1 ratio. Creates a nice popping, flashing. And if instead I did a 0.99, these things will slowly be shrinking down and leaving a trail behind with some artifacts. A lot of artifact. Not so nice yet. Yeah, I think difference isn't so nice when playing with this feedback. So I'm going to turn off the feedback, start it over again, let it do its course. And that's it for tonight. Thank you for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope it was not too frustrating where I went or didn't go with Tan. Tune in next week. I'll be back 9 o'clock Tuesdays, Central European time. Have a nice weekend.